Hello there, and welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, our special guest, former Governor of New York, George Pataki. He's the last Republican to win statewide in the Empire State. He also ran against Trump for the presidency once upon a time, and he has fascinating insights to share into this week's elections, as well as the passing of former Vice President Dick Cheney.
And I'm going to be looking at Trump's plan for a more aggressive crackdown on migrants. But first...
Election 2025.
As expected, Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani secured victory in the New York mayoral election this week with an almost 9-point win over former Democratic Governor Andrew Cuomo. Polls had predicted Mamdani's winning margin would be closer to 15%, but a last-minute collapse in support for the Republican, Curtis Sliwa, boosted Cuomo. Still, in the end, it wasn't really close, with Mamdani winning an outright majority on the back of the highest turnout since the late 1960s. The mayor-elect, who campaigned on affordability, promising things like free childcare, free buses and a rent freeze, among other measures, began his victory speech by quoting American socialist icon Eugene Debs.
The sun may have set over our city this evening, but as Eugene Debs once said, I can see the dawn of a better day for humanity.
And the quotes continued. In what may well have been a bit of a troll, Mamdani continued by quoting his vanquished rival's father, Liberal Democratic icon Mario Cuomo.
A great New Yorker once said that while you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. If that must be true, let the prose we write still rhyme, and let us build a shining city for all. And we must chart a new path, as bold as the one we have already traveled.
In between the progressive political references, he spoke directly to President Trump.
So hear me, President Trump, when I say this. To get to any of us, you will have to get through all of us.
If that was meant to be a warning to Trump to back off and not consider sending the military into New York City to support immigration enforcement efforts, the president's response suggested that he'll actually welcome any confrontation.
And so it begins.
It may be beginning, but something else seems to be ending. Andrew Cuomo was once seen as a potential American president, as was his father before him. After losing both the Democratic primary and now the general election to Zoran Mamdani, this would seem to be the end of the Cuomo political dynasty. Andrew Cuomo had the support of some top Democrats in this race, including former President Bill Clinton, and in defeat he had no kind words for Mamdani. He even got his name wrong and accused him of running a divisive campaign.
This campaign was necessary to make that point. A caution flag that we are heading down a dangerous, dangerous road. Well, we made that point, and they heard us, and we will hold them to it.
Zoran Mamdani takes office in January. His transition team announced this week might allay some Democrat fears that he might try and govern from outside the mainstream. It includes two former deputy mayors. Joe Biden's former Federal Trade Commission chair, Lena Khan, is also among that group, Chaz.
Yeah, he's also got a bunch of ex-Obama people as well involved. He seems to be a pragmatic sort to me. I think the whole extreme person has been well overcooked, yeah. I have to say. In fact, I would say, as far as Republicans are trying to paint this as, Democrats now all socialist. He's now the leader of the Democratic Party and they're all socialists. I'd say he probably won in spite of his socialism more than because of his socialism, in that I think he's a really good campaigner. Yeah. I think that if you look at the videos, he's everywhere on the internet at the moment. He got all over the place. If you look at the videos about him, the comments aren't going, oh, yay, finally a socialist. They're saying, this guy's normal.
Right.
Finally a normal politician. Isn't he likeable? Isn't he a nice guy? That's what the comments are saying.
Yeah.
And so I think that he's just comes off as really authentic and really effective as a campaigner.
And in very, very simple, non-ideological terms, he is promising things to make people's lives better. They will save money every time they catch a bus downtown, every time they drop their kids off at childcare, every time they go and buy groceries at one of his proposed city-run grocery stores for the less well-to-do in New York. I think a lot of people, you're right, don't care about labels like socialism. And if you're going to get, technical, some of the things that Donald Trump has been doing this year would meet the definition of socialism in terms of government taking over businesses, tariffs as well. Protectionism is often associated more with the left than the right. So people don't care about ideology. They care about the cost of living right now, and Memdani's tapped into that. And you're right, part of that is just he's a political talent.
And having said that, to the extent that some people do care about ideology, I think the socialist thing would have turned off as many Democrats as it attracted.
Yeah.
You look at the exit polls, Cuomo won about a third of the people who were favourable to the Democratic Party.
Right.
Those people presumably were scared off by the scare campaign, about, the scary socialist. So I think there were plenty of Democrats who didn't like that, but he still won because he's just a good politician.
Yeah, and to an extent, we are seeing a bit of a rerun of the Hillary versus Bernie 2016 and Biden versus Bernie 2020. But in the end, Bernie was able to influence Biden's agenda in the White House quite successfully. And it could well be that Memdani is going to be able to influence what the state Democrats end up doing in Albany, because it's the state governor and the Democratic State Assembly that has the power to do a lot of the things that Memdani has promised he'll do, but he doesn't have the money or the power to do.
That's certainly the big issue coming up. A key to his agenda is the $5 billion he wants to raise from corporate taxes, and he needs the state government to allow him to do that. And Kathy Hochul is running for re-election on a ticket of no tax hikes. So that's going to be an immovable object versus a...
They won't call it a tax hike. They'll say, we're closing loopholes for high-income.
Meanwhile, you got Trump. You mentioned that Trump was already hinting that he might get involved. According to The Atlantic, he's done more than hint. Apparently, he has told privately his staff that were Memdani to triumph, he would use that outcome as a justification to deploy troops to New York because it would be left inherently unsafe under socialist rule. And apparently also he has instructed his staff to try and find extra cuts from New York. He wants to punish New York because of electing Memdani, maybe get in the way of their congestion tax, for instance, which would cause Memdani no end of heartache. But on the other hand, if Trump takes on New York, then forget the socialist thing. It's Memdani versus the guy who's trying to destroy New York. Memdani, if you think he's popular now, you wait till Donald Trump tries to take New York down underneath him. Like, this could be the making of Memdani.
Yeah, and it could also be problematic because Republicans overperformed in New York in the last congressional elections. There are some vulnerable seats in the state of New York for Republicans. If Trump takes away federal funding for some big New York infrastructure projects, which is among the things he's threatening to do, that could make them lose a couple of seats on Long Island and help tip the House next year to Democrats. So this is a fascinating contest. It's certainly going to be one to watch. Meanwhile, in nearby New Jersey, what the polls suggested was shaping up to be a close contest there ended up being basically a blowout.
We see Mikey Sherrill, the projected winner of the New Jersey governor's race, nearing the podium, at the podium. Let's listen in.
They always say we're loud, but man, with this vote, you guys just scream from the rooftops.
It was sort of the electoral equivalent of a scream from the rooftops because Sherrill went into Election Day with just a 3-point lead in the average of polls. This is over Trump-backed Republican Jack Ciattarelli. But those polls missed the mark by almost double digits. Her 13-point win, the best by a Democrat since Governor Phil Murphy won big in 2017 in New Jersey. And of course, that was back in Trump's first year of his first term. Once again, the president was on the minds of voters this week and on the minds of candidates too.
We're not going to give in to our darker impulses. Here in New Jersey, we know that this nation has not ever been, nor will it ever be, ruled by kings.
Mikey Sherrill's a former Navy pilot, more of a centrist Democrat than the far-left Mamdani. Her wider-than-expected victory this week may add weight to those who are arguing that moderate Democratic candidates are the better option in close contests and swing states. Republican Licciardello, he tied himself very closely to Trump in this campaign, and that too could be a lesson for his fellow Republicans heading into the midterms next year. Interestingly, Licciardello did not mention Trump at all in his concession speech. An Associated Press poll found that roughly 4 in 10 voters in both New Jersey and Virginia said that they were casting their ballot literally to oppose Donald Trump. So he was certainly a big factor.
Yeah, no, he was. I'll tell you all about that in a second. But first of all, I should say, it's just too simplistic to be saying, moderates versus socialists with the Democrats. Like Mikey Sherrill, yes, she has a reputation as a moderate. But if you look at her actual policies, she's talking about freezing utilities. That's kind of Mamdani-esque. She's talking about raising taxes on the rich. You know, it's like it's a blurry line.
Of course.
What I would say, though, is Republicans are trying to act like New Jersey's the bluest state on earth, that they're reverse engineering this outcome. I remember a week ago when Licciardello looked like he might win, according to Republicans. He was coming home like a steam train. He was only 1 or 2 points behind, and Cheryl blew it out.
Yeah. I mean, that is the obvious spin for Republicans and Trump supporters to say, hey, nothing to see here. You know, breaking news, Democrats win in Democrat states. Big whoop.
But the thing is, Trump was only lost that by 6 points.
Yeah.
It's actually become quite a close state. Trump cleaned up Latinos in New Jersey. They came back home.
Yeah.
Like there was one Latino county, I've forgotten the name, I had written down here, where there was a 53-point swing to Democrats amongst Latinos. Mikey Sherrill won Latino men. She won them with 61% of Latino men vote. Remember how much they swung towards Trump?
Yeah.
So this is not just a blue state thing. In fact, history says she should have lost because no governor, either Republican or Democrat, has won, no party has won 3 governorships in a row since 1961 in New Jersey. And Phil Murphy was not popular.
No.
So there's something going on here, and I'll tell you more about that after we talk about Virginia.
Yeah, little caveat on some of those. Definitely some demographic groups changed their mind and their vote this time round. But of course, because we're talking about an off-year election, the electorate itself is smaller.
That's true.
And so a lot of the pro-Trump Hispanics, for example, stayed home. They didn't necessarily change their mind. But yes, I mean, that's what happens with non-compulsory voting. It was a pretty similar story in the Commonwealth of Virginia, meanwhile, where Mikey Sherrill's former roommate during their years in Congress together, Abigail Spanberger, easily saw off Republican Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earl Sears. Another moderate Democrat with national security credentials as a former CIA officer, Spanberger also blew out the expectations based on the polls, winning by close to 15 percentage points in a race that she'd been leading by an average of closer to 10. The pollsters got the Republican vote pretty much spot on, but they missed another 5% of Democrats who came out to vote. And again, one of the big issues driving that turnout was opposition to Donald Trump. Spanberger's state has hundreds of thousands of federal workers who've been affected first by the cuts under DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, and more recently furloughed by the shutdown, which has just this week ticked over to become the longest ever federal government shutdown. Spanberger had this message to both sides on that.
And tonight, as the governor-elect, I call on Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and our president to make real progress on bringing this shutdown to an end.
Yeah, we'll see where that shutdown comes to an end. It seems like the Democrats feel as though they're still winning a few political points on that. It might drag through for a few more days. Spanberger's electoral coattails were long enough, though, or the partisanship deep enough, to get embattled Attorney General candidate Jay Jones over the line. He won despite a texting scandal where he joked about killing a political rival. Polls had his opponent, Jason Miyares, up by 3 points, but instead it was Jay Jones by almost 6. So this was, I guess, the big upset of the day.
Yeah, that was the real result. You go, this guy is basically unelectable, and he still won by 6 points. And it wasn't just him either. The legislature had a huge result. It was the best result for the House of Delegates for Democrats since 1987.
Right.
So that's what, 40 years. They went from 51-seat majority to a 64-seat majority. Now, we should be clear. In Virginia, Democrats were expected to win. That is a situation where they really should have won. Yes. History says they should have won. Yep. We've talked about this before. Yep. Whoever the president is, the governor is the other one, right. The other side.
Glenn Youngkin won a year into Joe Biden's presidency. It was seen as a repudiation of Biden, but again, it fits his historical pattern.
Yeah, basically since 1977, it's only not happened once.
Yeah,
right. So we were expecting Scramberger to win. She also had twice as much money as Earl Sears as well. Trump never even endorsed Earl Sears, so he wasn't really invested in that as well as that. And also, she was a bit weird, let's be honest. So she wasn't a great candidate.
Yeah, so she bought into a whole bunch of those culture war issues that the MAGA movement favours, trans stuff, education stuff, a whole lot of things, but it just didn't work for her, at least not in Virginia.
No, absolutely. But I just want to first of all, just note the socialist moderate thing does apply in this case. Scramberger is very moderate and very anti-socialist overtly.
Right.
Back in 2020, just after Biden won, she famously got up in a conference call amongst Democrats and she said, we want to talk about funding social services, so let's talk about what we're for, and we need to not ever use the word socialist or socialism ever again, because while people think it doesn't matter, it does matter, and we lost good members because of it. Fast forward 12 months, Biden had just passed his legislation to fund America after COVID. He was running high. Democrats were all happy. There's no inflation at this point in time. But she was still chiding Biden for being too socialistic. She said nobody elected President Biden to be the Franklin Delano Roosevelt of this moment. They elected him to be normal and to stop the chaos. Okay, so it is fair to say that she is kind of the opposite of Mamdani. But she still went well.
Yeah.
And Mamdani went well, and Mikey Sherrill went well. Everyone went well. In fact, in Georgia, Democrats went well. In Mississippi, Democrats went well. They went well right across America. So what's going on? Is it just as simple as Trump?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, let me show you a graph, which I think is important to understand this. Forget socialists, forget moderates. This graph is showing you 2024 House races, the result, versus the presidential result in each of those districts. And you'll see they're identical. People just go along a 45-degree line, which means whatever the president gets is what the House rep gets every single time.
Straight ticket voting.
Yeah, candidate quality doesn't matter anymore. People are too partisan. So what's going on here is not just about Trump, but in particular, if you look at the exit polls, it's about Trump and the economy in particular. We have talked about this. In fact, I talked about this last week when we were talking about Trump's third term. And I said, let's look at the economy, shall we? Because if you have a look at the exit polls, in Virginia and New Jersey, economy-first voters, that's voters who say their first priority is the economy, sided with the Democratic gubernatorial candidates by a 65 to 35 margin, compared to 2024, when economy-focused voters broke for Trump, wait for it, 80 to 20. That is a 93-point turnaround amongst economy-first voters in New Jersey and Virginia in 12 months. That's just massive. And if I was a Republican, that is what I'd be freaking out about, because the economy isn't getting any better. They already blame Trump for it. Yep. They already hold him responsible for the tariffs, for the inflation, for the unemployment rate going up. They hold him responsible for all of it. He can't blame Biden anymore, and there's 12 more months before the midterms for it to get worse. Yeah. He's got a problem.
Yeah, and it's the same anti-incumbent backlash that Biden was facing before he dropped out last year, that Harris couldn't shake off. Trump benefited from it 12 months ago this week, and now it's come back to bite him. For more on all of this, though, I spoke to the former New York Governor George Pataki. He served 2 terms in the late 90s, early 2000s. He remains the last Republican to win statewide office in New York. Pataki was governor at the time of 9/11, and he led the state through its recovery. He then ran for president himself in 2016 in a crowded field that also included fellow New Yorker Donald Trump. Governor, a warm welcome to Planet America's Weekend Edition. Can I get your reflections on the election of Zoran Mamdani this week? 34 years old, a democratic socialist, the first Muslim elected to the mayoralty in New York City. That's all pretty historic, isn't it?
John, it's extremely historic. And, I'm a Republican, so I can't say I'm pleased by the outcome in New York City. But actually, when you look back at the election results, it was a Democratic sweep across the country, and New York was just a part of it. New York, of course, is different because he is a Muslim, he is a socialist, and that is something that will be interesting to see how it plays out over the course of the next few years. There's a lot of gloom and doom from business interests in New York. Let's see what happens. I'm still an optimist. I still believe in New York, and hopefully things will come together and move forward.
Governor, if you and Zoran Mamdani don't have much politically in common, there is one thing that you do have in common. You both beat a Cuomo to win office in New York. I wonder, have you been impressed by the way he's risen from virtually nowhere in the polls to winning this election?
I think actually the fact that he rose from nowhere was a plus. There's enormous dissatisfaction with career politicians, with the political establishment in both parties. And the other part of being a newcomer is Mamdani has no track record. He hasn't voted this way or voted that way in any significant manner. So he can say all sorts of things, promise all sorts of things, and doesn't have a record of whether or not he could deliver on that. So being a newcomer, I think, was a very real plus. Now he's going to have to deliver. Now he's going to have to make those promises he made of all these free things to the people who voted for him come true. And I think that's going to be a very different story.
Governor, what do you expect from the relationship between Zoran Mamdani and President Trump? Trump calls him a communist. Mamdani has been harshly critical of the president in return. Do you anticipate that Donald Trump is going to make Mamdani a target, a way of tarring all Democrats with this brush of socialism?
I think to an extent, yes. The big concern I have is that Mamdani needs the federal government. And the federal government is run by President Trump. And if he had any real interest in governing successfully, as opposed to making political statements, you wouldn't be taking on the president. You would be looking for reconciliation. You don't have to agree on policies. You don't have to agree on politics. But when it comes to things like federal funds for transportation or other things that New York City and New York State needs, you better try to get along. And I fear this confrontational attitude. It may be popular politically because Trump is not popular in New York City, but from a government standpoint, it's very destructive. And John, the real fear I have is not that Mamdani is going to succeed and that he's going to create this desire for socialism in other parts of the country. My real fear is that he's going to fail, but he's going to blame it on the fact that whether it's the state government in Albany or the federal government in Washington did not let him go far enough, and he'll have an excuse. And hopefully that won't be the case, but that to me is a very real concern.
Governor Pataki, let's talk a bit about some of the other races this week as well. A lot of the focus has been on Mamdani, but in both New Jersey and Virginia, more moderate, centrist Democrats had even bigger wins. What did you make of that?
It was really a shock. People, I think, expected the Democrat to win in Virginia. It's a relatively strongly Democratic state. But New Jersey was a shock. The polls showed a very close race, and yet the Democratic candidate won by 13 points, which is truly a landslide. And that tells you that there was great dissatisfaction and a desire for change. And the other thing that's important in elections that polls don't tell you is energy. I think the Democrats are energized. We saw that on the election eve. But Democrats across the country really energized to change things, send a message that we're not going to tolerate what is happening in Washington any longer. Whereas Republicans were somewhat complacent. All right, we won the presidency. We control the Senate. We control the House. Let's let them govern, and maybe we don't have to get out and show the energy and go vote this time. So I think one of the things the polls missed is that energy among Democrats to fight back and change things, and complacency on the Republican side that, things are going to be all right. And I think that reflected in results across the country.
Governor, do you expect that Republicans will take a lesson from Jack Ciattarelli's experience and possibly try and gradually distance themselves from President Trump heading towards next year's midterm elections? Or is it hard to sort of strike a balance with Donald Trump? You're either very much for him or very much against him.
Trump is the 800-pound gorilla. He just strides the stage and everybody else becomes a fifth player. So it's very hard to just somehow say, I'm distant from him. I think what Republicans are going to look for is to try to find some positive way to create a better sense of improvement in Washington. The first one being ending the government shutdown. I think that hurt Republicans. Yes, it's the Democratic Senate that would not pass a simple bill to keep the government open. But when you're in control, when you're the president, when you're the governor, when you're the executive, people don't care whose fault it might be. You get the blame. You're the head of the state. You have to deliver. So I think what Republicans really have to hope for is not to try to somehow run away and hide in the bushes from President Trump. That's not going to be possible. But that hope that Washington and the administration make some really successful, positive accomplishments where the American people say, okay, things are going all right. We can continue to support Republican candidates.
And Governor, do you expect President Trump will try and hit the reset button now the election is out of the way? Hopefully soon the shutdown will be resolved, because in recent weeks he seems to have been more tied up with knocking down the east wing of the White House and redecorating the Lincoln bathroom. He really didn't seem to care about these elections.
Well, I think he does, and I think he's aware of the consequences of what happened on the election night. And I think one of the first things I saw is that he's calling for an end to the government shutdown. And I think he's right on that. And how that will play out, how quickly that will happen, and what the compromise, assuming there is a compromise, will be, remains to be seen. But I think he's not a dumb person. He'll take a look at this and say, okay, we have to get some things done, and we have to make some, not changes in the direction of our policies, but maybe in the implementation of our policies. And just one example is the American people want a closed border. The American people want illegal immigrants who have committed crimes or are criminals deported. But they don't want someone who's been here 25 years and obeyed the law and worked in a family and raised kids to be dragged out. So I think the direction of the policies the president has been taking America in are correct. I think the American people support them. I think some of the perceived excesses that have happened are things that are going to have to be tweaked, or else the Republicans will see another election a year from now, like the one we saw this week.
Governor, can I get your thoughts on another big story of this week as well, the death of former Vice President Dick Cheney. He, of course, was serving in the White House while you were serving as Governor of New York at the time of 9/11. You had dealings with him, of course, then. How do you think he deserves to be remembered?
That's a tough question, because he did serve a number of American presidents well and honorably. But I think the most important issue of his career was the decision to push the Iraq war. And I think history is going to judge that decision to go to war with Iraq at a time when Osama bin Laden was still free in Afghanistan was the wrong decision. And it has negative consequences we're still seeing today with the chaos in the Middle East, and Iran having gotten so much stronger because its enemy, Iraq, had been destroyed by the United States. So I think the overarching issue for Vice President Cheney in his legacy will be that decision to go to war in Iraq. And I think it was the wrong decision, and I think it is something that will not play well. It doesn't play well today, and I don't think it will play well in history either.
And from your experience around that time of 9/11, leading up to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan as well, just how much power did you sense that Vice President Dick Cheney was wielding in the Bush White House? Has it tended to be overstated, or was he really one of the most powerful vice presidents in history?
Well, I think, there are two major elements in a presidency. There's foreign policy and domestic policy. On domestic policy, I don't think Vice President Cheney had any more disproportionate influence than any vice president ever has. But on foreign policy, you can't overstate the impact he had. I think he had a tremendous influence over President George W. Bush in those foreign policy decisions, particularly the one involving the war with Iraq. And that is something that in the past, I don't think a vice president had that power. But in the case of this administration, I think he did wield enormous influence, and in the Iraq question, with negative consequences.
Governor George Pataki, thank you for joining us on the weekend edition of Planet America.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it, John.
Interesting comments there from George Pataki about Dick Cheney. More for you on the death of America's 46th Vice President this week. Dick Cheney was a funny fella. He always looked rather like the fictional President Merkin Muffley from Dr. Strangelove.
We've always talked about the possibility of something going wrong with the bomb.
The bomb, Dimitri. And he sounded kind of like the Penguin from Batman.
My influential friends won't like this.
But to a generation of Democrats, Dick Cheney was probably more like Darth Vader.
Anger leads to hate, and hate leads to shooting your friend in the face.
Yes, he did do that too. In fact, the guy that Dick Cheney shot in the face actually apologised to him.
My family and I are deeply sorry for all that Vice President Cheney and his family have had to go through this past week.
Now that is power. Sorry for getting my face in the way of your bullets. But to his critics, Dick Cheney was a Machiavellian puppet master, manipulating an inexperienced President, George W. Bush, into war with Iraq based on claims that they possessed weapons of mass destruction.
If the UN is not willing to enforce its own resolutions, that we may then be left with no choice but for the United States and others who agree with us to proceed to disarm Saddam Hussein.
That decision had huge and horrible consequences following the US-led invasion. More than 500,000 Iraqi people were killed, including Saddam, who was executed for his decades of violent oppression and war on his neighbours. But no weapons of mass destruction were ever found. It was the greatest intelligence failure in US history. It also cost more than 4,000 American lives, as well as much of their moral authority. Dick Cheney was the ultimate Washington insider. Back in 1975, at the age of just 34, he'd become the youngest ever White House Chief of Staff to President Gerald Ford. After Ford's defeat, Cheney won a seat in Congress from Wyoming. He served in the House Intelligence Committee. It was from there that the first President Bush tapped Dick Cheney to be his Defence Secretary, ultimately making him a central player in the Gulf War. But, of course, it will be Dick Cheney's vice presidency, which also helped to expand the power of government generally, the vice president and the president, that he'll be the longest remembered for, Chaz.
Yeah, he's an interesting character. I mean, his personality was probably admirable. He had a lot of dignity. He didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't care. He just got the job done.
He never wanted to be president. He had the power without having to kiss the babies and shake their hands.
He was just doing what he thought was right and backing himself in and treated people with respect, etc. Of course, that's his personality. Policy-wise, he's responsible for torture. Personally, that was his program that he was pushing. He's responsible for security state.
Yeah.
He is the one.
The Patriot Act was, he got that passed through Congress.
It was his baby. Like we were talking about the Iraq War before. He wasn't the only one behind that, but he was overwhelmingly the person pushing torture in the security state. In fact, when Obama started killing people with drones, Cheney congratulated him. Like, he liked it. He was a true believer in this stuff, John. As far as he was concerned, he was the reason, and his programs were the reason America wasn't attacked again after 9/11. Now, you can believe that, or you can not believe that. I personally think a lot of the information sharing amongst intelligence and law enforcement could have occurred without the security state, and that's the real reason America hasn't been attacked since, I would suggest. But you can disagree with me. You can say, no, Dick Cheney's the one who did it. And if so, he's one of the great figures of the last 30 years. If you disagree with that and you agree with me, then he might be one of the great villains of the last 30 years. Either way, he was a great in American politics. There is no denying that.
Highly consequential, controversial. He embraced the comparisons with Darth Vader. He was happy to be seen as the bad guy. It helped George W. Bush's re-election to have everyone think that Dick Cheney was the baddie and that George W. Bush, well, we still quite like him. Cheney offered several times to drop off the ticket in 2004. Bush wouldn't let him go because he valued his counsel that much. So he was, hugely important.
That also goes to his character, that he was willing to just commit career suicide and say, I won't be vice president.
Yeah, he'd have probably just gone back to Halliburton and made another $10 million out of those defence contracts.
Fascinating guy.
Gin up. Yeah. Sure. There's another election this week that we should update you on as well.
Here in California, Proposition 50 is poised to pass easily. That'll allow the state to temporarily end its independent process for shaping congressional districts and adopt new maps to oust 5 Republicans.
And this is what the Democrat-controlled state legislature is expected to do with their newfound power.
Democrats think they will get 5 additional seats. The Republicans will go their delegation potentially from 9 down to as few as 4, as basically they carve up the state in a way that spreads the Republicans very thin, just off of the coast entirely.
48-4. So Republicans, who can get close to 40% of the statewide vote in California, will have less than 8% of House seats. It is obviously, clearly, deliberately a gerrymander, which, as we've discussed, comes in response to a gerrymander by Republicans down in Texas. California's governor and presidential possible, Gavin Newsom, makes no apology for that. And even more than the other contest this week, it turns out that this vote was about one Donald Trump.
We're proud of the work that the people of the state of California did tonight to send a powerful message to an historic president. Donald Trump is an historic president. He is the most historically unpopular president in modern history.
And it's going to shock you to learn that President Trump is crying foul.
The unconstitutional redistricting vote in California is a giant scam, and that the entire process, in particular the voting itself, is rigged. All mail-in ballots where the Republicans in the state are shut out is under very serious legal and criminal review. Stay tuned.
Oh, we will. On Tuesday, the White House press secretary even claimed, without providing any evidence, that fraudulent ballots were being mailed in California with the names of illegal aliens who should not be voting. Again, no evidence. Now, last week, Chaz, you spoke to academic Lee Drutman about America's ageing politicians, on average many years older than comparable countries. Well, maybe Nancy Pelosi was watching, because the 85-year-old former Democratic House Speaker announced earlier today that she will not run for re-election again next year. So the end of another highly consequential political career.
Another great. Now, there have been all kinds of horror stories this year involving overly aggressive immigration enforcement, like this story from Chicago.
Patricia Fisher says she came out to the hallway of her apartment complex on the corner of 75th and South Shore Drive in her nightgown around 10 Monday night, only to find ICE agents yelling police.
It was scary because I've never had a gun put in my face. They asked my name and my date of birth and asked me did I have any warrants, and I told them no, I didn't.
She says she was then handcuffed and released around 3 a.m. Neighbors tell us there were dozens of ICE agents. Neighbors like Ebony Watson says they ducked for cover as they heard several flashbangs go off.
They was terrified. The kids was crying. People was screaming. They looked very distraught. I was out there crying when I seen the little girl come around the corner. Because they was bringing the kids out too. Had them zip tied to each other. That's all I kept asking. Where's the morality? Where's the human? One of them literally laughed. He was standing right here. He said, them kids.
Watson says budget trucks and military-style vans were used to separate parents from their children. Other neighbors say they saw agents destroying property to get in the building.
And they had a big 15-inch chainsaw with a round blade on it, cutting this fence down. We're under siege. We're being invaded by our own military.
Also breaking, that same incident in Little Village, also sparking a notice of alleged violations against Border Patrol Chief Gregory Bovino. There's a court filing by the Chicago Headline Club, and it accuses Bovino of throwing tear gas into a crowd without justification, violating the temporary restraining order in place.
But a lot of these kinds of stories, including those two there, have something in common. Before I explain what it is, let's just take a step back. Something a lot of people don't realise is that ICE typically conducts very targeted operations. They largely go after illegal immigrants who are criminals or those with deportation orders. By contrast, though, Border Patrol can be extremely aggressive and sweeping. And Border Patrol have often been responsible for the more controversial immigration enforcement operations this year. Those videos we saw before, plus many other viral videos, were actually about Border Patrol, not ICE. But ICE often gets blamed for Border Patrol's actions because the media and activists can't really tell the difference between these federal agents. so it sucks to be ICE. The problem, though, is that there apparently is quite a lot of friction between those two agencies. Border czar Tom Homan and ICE Director Todd Lyons, on one hand, want to prioritise targeting criminals and the worst of the worst, whereas Border Patrol Commander Greg Bovino wants to use aggressive tactics to arrest anyone in the US who's there illegally and ramp up deportation numbers. Guess which of those two agencies the Trump administration prefers? Steve Miller has been all over ICE this year like a poor man's Lex Luthor, demanding that they deport more people. Not only have they been falling short of Miller's personal target of 3,000 immigration arrests per day, but they haven't even been close, detaining on average only about 1,100 people per day. And apparently, this has finally reached breaking point. The administration wants to see a lot more rappelling into apartment buildings from Black Hawk helicopters and jumping out of rental trucks in Home Depot parking lots. And to get it, they've reassigned at least a dozen directors of the most critical ICE field officers. And at least a half of them are apparently going to be replaced by Border Patrol people. We're talking nearly a half of ICE's leaders gone in one fell swoop. So does that mean we're about to see a whole lot more horror stories? Maybe. To find out, I spoke to the former Deputy Chief of the US Border Patrol, Matt Hudak. Matt Hudak, welcome to Planet America. According to the media, ICE has been trying to conduct targeted raids of criminals like a scalpel, whereas Border Patrol have been going a lot more aggressively like a scoop. How much do you think that impression that we've got reflects reality?
Typically ICE and the way they operate is it is a much smaller organization, so they tend to have smaller operations. I think maybe surgical is a good word to describe that. It may be a team of agents or deportation officers that spend a week of time surveilling and tracking one person to try to make that arrest. Where Border Patrol, we're certainly, that agency is used to doing things at a larger scale, has more manpower, so has the ability to go after, maybe targets that have, or an investigation that has multiple targets involved, where you have enough people to be able to kind of sweep in and pick up those multiple targets at the same time. So, those two modes of operation are going to look very different to the outsider that's observing that.
There's been reporting of friction between, on one hand, Border czar Tom Homan and ICE Director Todd Lyons, who want to focus on what they call the worst of the worst, and on the other side, DHS Chief Kristi Noem and CBP Commander Greg Bovino, who want to focus on mass deportations. Does that ring true to you?
Yeah, I think to a certain extent that's true, and that's true. You name the context, I retired a little less than 2 years ago, and, we were dealing with some of those same challenges where you had different officials within either the department, the agency, or even at the White House that kind of had different expectations and a different view of how things should be unfolding. So that's not necessarily something unique, and there's certainly, ways to kind of balance that out in the system. But I think it is clear just from the speeches, from the comments that have been made, that there's some varying levels of expectations of what they want to be either prioritizing or looking at.
So do you think it's significant that ICE leadership in so many key places seems to have been recently deposed in favour of Border Patrol replacements?
So, if that does come to fruition, and certainly that's the word on the street, so to speak, I think if it does, then that does definitely send a clear message of, what the administration is looking for, and then certainly, where they're willing to put their time and effort and focused resources in is always an indication of what their priorities are. So I think if we do see that take place, that certainly is an indication that, the administration is moving in a different direction and looking for a different set of results.
Obviously, the manner of immigration enforcement has been quite controversial this year. What do you think the administration has generally done well, and what do you think they have not done so well?
I think, first and foremost, I think what they have done well is actually gone back to the law books and actually looked at the law, and at the same time empowered law enforcement to actually enforce the law. That's a challenging space to be in, and certainly, spent a lot of my time during a period of time where, that was not the priority. So I think that's something that they've gotten right, is focusing law enforcement on actually going out, doing investigations, making arrests of criminal violations, and making it clear that the law is there and the law will be enforced. I think some of the challenges, just like with anything, it's communication. How do you explain, we're going after priority targets, which they are, but then, when you see, a large number of people getting arrested in one enforcement action, to the outsider, maybe those two don't line up. So then, that messaging, that communication of being, kind of transparent and forthright with, this is what we're doing, this is what we're not doing, and then this is the purpose behind it. I think that's something that is just universally always a challenge, but I think that's something that, some more time spent there would go a long way.
So would you say your primary concerns have been in the communications area rather than in their actions per se?
I think but the communications certainly contribute to that. And I think, where we see these protests, I don't think is necessarily the right word. I think we do see a combination of protests, but I think we also see this large effort of obstruction taking place. I think that comes from a lack of communication and, maybe a confusion or lack of clarity on what's happening. I think if there was an ability to be a little more direct with what is happening, what isn't happening, and maybe give a little bit more of the background, I think, you would not silence all the critics, but I think, getting that information out to at least people that are objective and willing to listen goes a long way.
What about the number of US citizens and people with valid visas who seem to be detained for lengthy periods of time? ProPublica found at least 170 citizens detained so far. Is that inevitable when you have these kinds of chaotic operations, or do you think DHS has been overly aggressive and making too many mistakes?
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, but maybe not in the sense that you're thinking about. So it's not inevitable in the sense of, if you cast a broad net, you're going to, draw in a lot of people. But you have to look at a scenario where, let's say, there is one or two targets that have outstanding warrants, deportation orders that you're going after, and then you end up finding them at a location, a residence, whatever. You make the arrest of those people. There's other folks that you determine to be illegal aliens that are there. You make those arrests, and then you have one or two US citizens that are there as part of that. Well, to an investigator, you're looking at, was there knowledge there of their illegal status? Were they involved in harboring or concealing those illegal aliens, which itself is a federal crime? So yes, they could be detained, but it could be a detention based on the fact that we have all this evidence that could indicate that there is a felony involving some, smuggling, harboring, crimes, and now we have to investigate and collect the evidence related to that. So there, as I mentioned earlier, there's always a lot going on in the background that isn't always obvious to somebody standing on the side of the street. But I think it is fair when those cases happen for people to ask questions. And when a detention occurs, I think there is an obligation at some point to be able to explain why that detention occurred. And if it was resolved in a release without charges, then we should be able to explain that as well.
Finally, is there anything you'd like to say to American citizens who might be concerned about what's going on in the immigration enforcement space?
Yeah, I think to continue to ask questions, engage your lawmakers. I think that's important. Keeping in mind that that there is a body of officials in DC that make the laws. So if there's views on that, then I think that needs to be something communicated through the constituent process with those elected leaders. But I think another important message too is, maybe you have a philosophical problem or issue with, immigration enforcement. I maybe can understand that. There's people that have a philosophical view on, recreational drug use. I get everybody's difference of opinion, but going out there and, hurling rocks, firing weapons at federal agents or, local state police officers engaged in their duties, that is not the way to address those concerns. And, to your question before about, should people be uncomfortable or uneasy? I think the ones that are going out there and agitating those groups that are involved in that terroristic activity, that are involved in the assaulting and impeding, they should be concerned about that, because they are creating a much more dangerous situation, and more than likely will catch up with them in terms of criminal arrest like we've seen already.
Matt Hudak, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thank you very much, Taz.
That's all for another trip to Planet America. Our next edition is on ABC TV Monday night, 9:40 p.m. Eastern Summer Time. You'll also find us on ABC iView, YouTube and Facebook.
And we have another weekend edition next Friday on ABC News. And do not forget to pay up. The Planet Extra podcast is to be found in all the finest pod places right there. See you there.
Bye.